The political earthquake overnight with word that the Department of Justice is investigating launched a criminal investigation into Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve. They say it's over. Potential testimony he gave over renovations to the Federal Reserve building. But Powell, in this extraordinary video statement, says it's something about completely different. He says this is about the Fed's independence and the Federal Reserve's ability to raise and lower interest rates independently from political winds. They think it's incredibly important that the Fed acts independently of Donald Trump. And they think it's best for the economy. We're talking about more than 2/3 of adults, 68%, 91% of Democrats, 75% of independents, and even 41%, 2/5 of Trump's base, thinks it's important that the Fed acts independently of Trump for the best of the economy. So when you get 41% of Republicans and 91% of Democrats agreeing on something with 75% of independents, you know, it is a popular position. The bottom line is the American people vigorously disagree with the President, the United States, on this. They want a Fed that acts independently of him because they think it's best for the economy. Jerome Powell, not the most popular guy in the world, but at -3 points. He's actually the most popular guy that Gallup poll of any of the politicians, any of the folks in government. He is far more popular than Donald Trump when it comes about the economy in general. How's the president doing it? Yeah, I think this is, of course, a big portion of it, right? It's not just about the cuts, it's also about the economy. That is a drop of what, 25 points in just a year's time? President Trump has made crystal clear that he wants lower interest rates. You know, the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, suggesting this entire criminal investigation is over the president's desire to get lower interest rates. What do the prediction markets think about whether they will get lower interest rates? No, it's not going to work for Donald Trump. Take a look here. The chance that the Fed Reserve maintains interest rates in January 90th, 4%. Despite the threats from Donald Trump, it seems that Jerome Powell, the prediction markets think will hold his ground along with the rest of the Fed. I'm joined by a terrific group of reporters. I mean, I don't know. I don't think his job is to build buildings, so maybe that's great. That's a fair criticism. Every contractor would be indicted if that was not for you. That's true. But you know, I sort of joked about using the word unprecedented so many times. But Frank, this is one of those moments we have to take a step back and remind people, oh, this is not normal. This is not run-of-the-mill Washington stuff, is not normal. And part of the reason is not normal is that the Fed exists in almost this sacred space in our politics and our economics. It was created in 1913 to take interest rates setting out of the hands of politicians. Because if we left management of the economy to politicians, they would print cheap money on the eve of every election. And they'd flood, and we'd be stuck in a cycle of endless financial crises. And the Fed. After the Fed was created, we basically removed bank runs and crises from our system. They used to be something that happened every decade or so. That doesn't happen because... And what makes this such an interesting test is that I think a lot of Trump supporters in Silicon Valley, on Wall Street, they all know, and there are brains in their heart of hearts, that maintaining the independence of the Fed is the ballgame. It's the foundation of our strength and the economy. Yeah, no question. Now that is, nobody is saying, even those who are the most critical, that if there is something that is done that is illegal or untoward, that there should be an investigation. But as you just heard directly from Powell in that extraordinary statement, that is not what most think is actually going on. In fact, just adding to this extraordinary evening and morning, the last, I guess, 12 hours. A group of former Fed chairs, you know, appointed by Democrats and Republicans alike, including Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, Janet Yellen, and there were other Treasury secretaries and economics who signed on to a statement. And I'm going to read some of it right now. This is how monetary policy is made in emerging markets and weak institutions with highly negative consequences. Consequences, rather, for inflation and the functioning of their economies more broadly. It has no place in the United States, whose greatest strength is the rule of law, which is at the foundation of our economic success. I mean, quite a statement from them. And look, I think there's two things we're probably going to see come out of this. Two reactions, at least I'm looking very closely at one, is of course how the markets are responding to this. We've seen them down a little bit today, but how this continues. And if the market really does react in a way that sets off alarm bells inside the West Wing. Because I'd remind you, the president has talked in the past repeatedly about wanting to fire Jerome Powell. And he was talked out of it by his top economic advisors, people like Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bassett. The other thing is, of course, what we're going to see with Capitol Hill. I mean, I thought one of the statements from Thom Tillis, a retiring Republican, him coming out and saying, essentially pledging to oppose any future Trump appointees for the Fed until this is resolved, is a huge deal. Yeah, but one thing is, I wanted to point out, is just, you read that quote from the president last night to NBC News saying, insisting he doesn't have anything to do with this. 2 weeks ago, when he was speaking publicly, he actually said that he believed a lawsuit was coming against Powell over this exact issue. He called it, I have this quote here. He said, "We're thinking about bringing a gross incompetence." What he said was called a gross incompetence lawsuit against Powell. That's, of course, catching a lot of people by surprise when they're saying, you're saying you've nothing to do with this. But you led or gave a leading answer about some of this. So he has definitely been more clearly felt, more liberated to say what he really thinks. If there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none. It is now the independence and credibility of the Department of Justice that are now in question. And then he went on, as Elena said, to say that he's going to hold up any nominations, which is significant because Trump didn't fire Powell, but his term is up in a couple of months. Yeah, it is significant. In part because we haven't seen that level of backbone from Republicans using their power of advice and consent to hold the president and the administration to account. They have not used their ability to stop or block nominations, and they have not said, I will not continue with any of these presidential nominations unless I see what I need to see from the administration. Thom Tillis is doing that. We saw from Senator Lisa Murkowski essentially endorsing that approach. And we're waiting to see whether other Republicans are going to be willing to speak up. And the fact that President Trump's own nominee, Jay Powell, did release that video speaking out and saying this is a pretext. This is not about a law that was broken. This is clearly the president trying to exert influence over the Federal Reserve and take away the independence of the Fed. Speaking in very plain language, it's pretty clear between Jay Powell and Thom Tillis that some people who previously may have not been willing to speak out are now willing to speak out. And we'll have to wait and see if more. Let's do that.